The winter of late 1977 to early 1978 saw a lot of firsts for TSR, including the publication of the world's first hardback book for a role-playing game, the first exploration of mixing H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu within a D&D game, and the publication of the first fictional novel set in a role-playing game world of Greyhawk. We're going to talk about all of those, as well as many other things happening in my review of Dragon Magazine's number 11 and 12 today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. And specifically, this video is going to be my review or overview, really, of Dragon Magazine issues number 11 and 12, and talking about the creators and the artists and also the articles in those magazines, those two issues, that had an impact, or if they had an impact, on the future of the game development of the role-playing game hobby, or Dungeons & Dragons specifically. Now, in the little snippet at the beginning, sort of that teaser trailer, at the front of the video, I talked about a few specific things like the release of the first hardback book for Dungeons & Dragons or of any role-playing game. I talked about H.P. Lovecraft and Cthulhu, and I talked about the first novel being released that was, set a fictional novel that it was for a role-playing game, and it was specifically about Dungeons & Dragons, and even more specifically than that, it was about the world of Greyhawk, and that was the first of any kind of game-related fiction book that had ever been published. So I am going to cover all of those as we go through these issues, but this time I'm going to go through the issues in order. I think it just kind of makes a little bit more sense this time rather than jumping back and forth. However, there are chapter stops, so if you only want to hear about just those specific things, just use the timestamps, and you can find those specific chapters later in the video. However, I do hope that you stick around and watch all of it. I would really appreciate it. And, you might learn something about, part of these magazines that you weren't aware of. I also think I wanted to point out that this is now going to be my 90th video. I've been making videos for a little bit longer than a year and a half now. I started in February of 2023, and it is now September of 2024. And I just surpassed, after my last video, like shortly thereafter last week, I surpassed 10,000 subscribers. So thank you all so much for your support of the channel, for subscribing. And I'm really glad that you are enjoying these videos. Please continue in the comments to leave notes about what you'd like to see me cover in the future. Just be aware, if you could, that my early days of tabletop role-playing game were pretty dominated by the TSR published games. So clearly Dungeons & Dragons, but also, I've talked before about Top Secret. I've talked about Gamma World and Star Frontiers and Marvel superhero role-playing game. And those were kind of like what I spent most of my time playing until I found a new group after we moved and we started playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But I hear a lot of folks saying like, oh, how come you don't cover things like Tunnels and Trolls, which, I've mentioned briefly in a video, or like RuneQuest or Palladium and all those kinds of games. It's because I just didn't play them. And so I feel a little disingenuous talking about them because I probably just don't have the passion for them as somebody like who's asking for that video would have. And I feel like I might not do it justice to those folks who are really interested in that. So, but that said, if you really want to know something about those and want to see me cover it, go ahead and leave it. I do keep track of what everybody says, and I can always try to put a different spin on it, maybe coming from someone who is an outsider, didn't grow up playing those games. I'd also like to continue to ask for your support for the channel. So if you could please leave a like on this video after you've had a chance to watch it. Hopefully you like it, and to continue subscribing to my channel and sharing my content with other folks who are interested in this kind of stuff, early tabletop role-playing game history. I also do videos where I talk about the campaign that I run for my daughter and her friends. It's not really about a teenage campaign. It's just about my way of running a campaign that might be different from yours, and you might learn something from that. And then from time to time, I also do role-playing game reviews. I'm usually skewed a little bit toward more kind of like original editions of the game or early editions of Dungeons & Dragons, but I cover a variety. So the best way right now that you can support my channel is by becoming a super fan. Just so click that little heart with the $ inside if you have the means of contributing to the channel, which helps support me as I'm trying to upgrade my equipment. I've talked about that before, and I am trying to save money due to some work situation things that are happening, and any little bit like that helps. And then also you can visit my shop. I do have a brand new design in my shop, designed specifically to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the debut of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. So this shirt design was inspired by the cover of the classic white box, but it's the same terminology that was used on the original sort of like wood grain covered box from 1974. Pencils and paper and miniature figures. And I put the little star logo on there that says original collector's edition. I think it looks great on a white t-shirt because it evokes that sort of white box. But that's brand new in my shop. And right now, up until August 12th of 2024, if you buy anything from my shop and use the code EARLYBIRD, all caps, all one word, you'll get 10% off your order. All right, so let's jump in and talk about Dragon Magazine issue number 11. So with this cover here by Elro here. So this is like the, I think, third cover that we've seen. We're going to keep seeing a few more as time goes on, but I really like this cover here with the this kind of like, traveling circus / caravan sort of thing. It's very colorful, but I like using like traveling things like this, again, like a circus or a caravan in my games, because it gives an excuse to introduce like different wandering cultures coming into town and exposing the populace there to new ideas, new creatures, new foods, whatever it is. And I've used them before in the game I run for my daughter, and they got a kick out of it. So this is the cover from, this is the December 1977 issue. So it says volume 2, number 5, but it's issue number 11, still $1.50 in cover price. And then as we go on here, now one thing I will mention as well as I'm going through this, you might hear some clicking from time to time, and that's just my mouse. I'm clicking through, and can't really figure out a way to edit that out, unfortunately. So I'll try to keep it to a minimum. But these are this is the opening spread of the ad. So the inside front cover ad here on the left-hand side for the official Dungeons & Dragons fantasy figures. These were some of the very first ones, and these are the demons. So this was a very big deal. Demons debuted in Eldritch Wizardry Supplement 3, which came out in 1976. And so then these are the figures that are sort of replicating the creatures that you would have seen in there. Also, the Dungeon Master or the Monster Manual is coming out in 1977. I mentioned that in the intro. And most of these creatures are in there as well. And so that picture of Demogorgon, that's pretty close to the one we're going to see in the Monster Manual. All right, so then over here on the right-hand side, you see Strategy and Fantasy World Fantasy Games. So this is just a retailer ad. They have 5 locations in Massachusetts, Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and New York. So this is a pretty big, I guess, franchise that you would call it. And again, they're taking out a full-page ad in a national, or actually at this point, international magazine, just to advertise the stock of games that they have that you can order from them, I guess, if you live somewhere where you can't get the games that you want locally. So that's that. All right, now we're on over here to the Dragon Rumbles, which again, this is sort of Tim Kask's editorial little opinion piece that he puts at the beginning of the issue. And usually what he talks about in here is what's happening in this issue. And this one's no different. So the big thing that he points out, and it's even mentioned on the cover here, as you see, is featuring Sea Magic, S&S, so Sword and Sorcery by Fritz Leiber. So that was the main thing that they were advertising that was going to be in this issue. And I've talked about this before, but Tim Kask was a huge fan of them running sword and sorcery fiction, fantasy fiction, and science fiction in Dragon Magazine. To him, I get the impression that it was as important, if not more so, than the game-related content that they were putting in here. So he leads off by talking about like how exciting it is for them to be publishing this short story, Sea Magic. And we'll talk a little bit about that more as we go through the issue and we get to that actual story. And then he talks about Snit Smashing is going to be in here, and Snit's Revenge. So Snit Smashing was a game that we reviewed earlier that debuted in a previous issue of Dragon. And this is sort of the sequel game sequel / companion game is what Tim Cask says, Snit's Revenge. And then they've also included some errata for the original Snit game. And then he talks about the big news in here, and this is sort of what I really want to focus on, is that they've hired more staff, and specifically they've hired Joe Orlowski to be the editor of Little Wars magazine. So if you recall this period in time, Dragon Magazine and Little Wars were being published kind of concurrently, although Dragon quickly became the bigger of the two and started to have a more regular publishing schedule. Little Wars publishing schedule kind of started to contract a little bit. But he talks in here about that Joe has been hired to manage Little Wars because in the past, Tim Cask was managing both, was editing and overseeing both. So it says that means that Little Wars is now primarily Joe's responsibility, while TD, again, meaning The Dragon, is primarily belonging to Tim Cask. But they both work on both magazines, just different amounts on each. And so I saw some information that Tim Cask mentioned in an interview or I think it was like in the forums, might have been Dragon's Foot, but he talked, it was very, very brief, but he essentially said he hired Joe to handle kind of like subscriptions and fulfillment and stuff. So the magazine was growing very, very quickly at this period in time. And as you've seen, if you watch these videos before, the entire staff of the magazine sometimes consisted of just like 4 people, and usually 2 of those were like artists. So they really needed help, but Tim specifically needed help to manage this. So Joe was kind of hired to kind of help manage those types of things. And so Joe Orlowski, his main contribution to role-playing games specifically that we're talking about here is this job that he's going to be an editor at, TSR Periodicals for, Dragon and Little Wars. And then after he leaves, after Little Wars folds, which is going to be not that long from now, unfortunately, it didn't last very long. And, for those who haven't seen my previous videos, Little Wars basically covered the more like strategic board games, like, like the war games kind of things, miniature games and war games, whereas Dragon focused more on like fantasy gaming as well as like we talked about fiction. So after Little Wars folds, Joe Orlowski leaves, goes and opens up a game store in Chicago. And that's kind of his thing that he did within the gaming community. And then he unfortunately passed away back at the early part of the new century here. I think it was 2003 maybe that he passed away, which is, really too bad because he wasn't that old at the time of his passing. So Tim talks about that, and then he talks about how that impact on staff means that the Dragon is going to be coming out monthly from now on, starting in the next issue, and Little Wars is going back to bi-monthly every other month, when it had actually, at this point, Little Wars had started out bi-monthly, and then it contracted to being only 4 issues a year, but now it's going to go back to being bi-monthly because they have a new managing editor. Again, we just talked about it's not going to last for very long, but that was the hope. And then he talks about some more fiction that's going to be coming out in future issues. We'll just talk about those when we get there. But that was kind of a big deal. The main one here being he's talking about a Harold Shea story by Elsbrich de Camp for his Complete Enchanter series. So as Tim talks about this book, he mentions that it's like a missing story from the series, The Incomplete Enchanter. And he says it was last printed in a now defunct SF, science fiction magazine, in the early 50s. So that was Beyond Fiction from 1954. I saw that it also had been reprinted later on in a hardback version that came out called Wall of Serpents in 1960. However, Tim says that it's not been published since the early 50s in that magazine that's gone under, so it's hard to get by. And so they were really happy to reprint it here. But that's coming up. So he talks about that. And then he basically says, like, even though the most expert of dungeon masters can learn from this amazing collaboration series how to set adventures within an entire mythos. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. He says, even, again, the most expert of dungeon masters, you can always learn something as a dungeon master, and you should always be trying to learn something. Look for inspiration from new places and be open to new ideas and how to improve your games. Okay, so that's the introduction there. And then we see here over on the left, in this little box section, the staff essentially. And we've talked, now that we've mentioned Joe Orlowski, we've talked about all these people before. So the three artists, Dave Sutherland, Dave Trempier, Tom Wam. The cover by El Rohier, we talked about that in the past, like El Rohier in the very first cover that he did. So that's basically going to be it. So over here on the right-hand side, we have this guest editorial, it says, by Gary Gygax, which is called View from the Telescope, Wondering Which End is Which. So this is a really interesting editorial. Now, you have to keep in mind where we're at here in 1977. So this is December of 77. So this would have been written, around that time, maybe a month or two before. And so TSR, began as Tactical Studies Rules in 1974 with Gary and Don Kay and Brian Bloom. And we're going to talk about that a little bit here. But it changed into TSR Hobbies, Inc. And by this point, there's been some issues coming up with Gary as far as who owns what. And that we're going to see impact some future things that we're going to see in these two issues of the magazine we're talking about. But one of the things that's happened during this time is that Gary has made the employees who work at TSR sign a document, a contract basically saying that anything that they create while they are employed at TSR, while they're working there, is the property of TSR. And Gary signs it himself, and that's going to get into a lot of trouble later if you know your history. So flash forward about 8 years from now, and that's going to come back to sort of bite him. But he signs and says, I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to sign this document. And it's, it is pretty standard when you work in a creative industry. It's not always fair, but it was pretty standard at this time. Most of the people that created the comic book characters that we're all familiar with signed something similar, that the things that they create belong to the company, not to them. And Gary signs over the rights of Dungeons and Dragons to TSR. And there's a whole host of reasons why he did that, but he was being very, I don't want to say he's being manipulative. He was signing the contract that he wanted everyone else to sign. But the reason that he was able to sign it so easily is because at the time he was one of the main people who owned TSR, and it never occurred to him that that might not be the case. So to him, TSR owning Dungeons & Dragons was the same thing as him owning Dungeons & Dragons when he signed that. But the reason that that's important for this is because if you've watched my previous videos on my history series, you know that Dave Arneson, co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, was hired as an employee by TSR in 1976, but he also leaves in 1976 due to having a falling out with Gary and how the game was progressing in the direction that it was taking, and he didn't like that. And there was issues with him signing that document as far as like what his ownerships were, what his ownership's rights were to the stuff that he had created. And so he leaves TSR. Now, what's going to happen in 1977 is that Dave Arneson is writing a publication called the Dungeon Masters Index. So Dungeon Masters, all one word. But the idea was that he was writing a compilation of all the rules that had come out for original Dungeons & Dragons, including the 4 supplements, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Eldritch Wizardry, and Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. And so he's consolidating all that into an index so that you can find the magic items, the treasures, the monsters, things like that. I think maybe spells is in there as well, but he was putting that all into one easy to use booklet so that you could find the exact thing that you were looking for without having to flip through 7 different books, because remember the original game, there were 3 little pamphlet books, and then you had the 4 additional supplements. So you've got 7 books to look through, and he was going to put everything into one, what he called the Dungeon Masters Index. Well, TSR wasn't happy about that because to them, that was using their property and trying to sell something off of that. So you have to keep that context in mind as knowing that that is one of the reasons why Gary Gygax writes this article. It's not the only one, but it is a main one. And I'm going to read quite a bit of this. I'm not going to read it word for word, but I want to focus on a few different things. So he says, it's not uncommon to read tirades in amateur press association magazines front and semi-irate letters in the letter columns of small, in quotes, journals berating TSR in general and at times anyway, me in particular. So he's shots fired right out the gate. He's, I know Amateur Press Association is the name for that particular kind of thing, but Gary starts to use it more derogatorily as opposed to a descriptor. And then he talks about like being attacked for attitudes regarding the use of our copyrighted material by others. So what's happening is TSR is starting to come down on people saying like, you can't do that. Especially you can't claim that you've created something that's compatible with Dungeons and Dragons and TSR products, because those are trademarks that we own and you didn't ask for permission. And, people complain about that a lot. TSR got really suit happy as time went on. And it wasn't just under Gary's, oversight. It was also during the Lorraine Williams era as well. Because these are things that's how they make their money. So, but he basically says, like, what villains we are to resent infringement of our legal rights by others. After all these good fellows wish to do is steal from us just a few crumbs or a small slice, which we wouldn't miss anyway. So again, it's pretty sarcastic, but he's very clear what his stance is on this. And he says, so allow me to afford some perspective. And then he goes back to tell once again. So this is like at least the second time we've seen him do this in Dragon Magazine. What his version of the history of the creation of Dungeons and Dragons is. And you're going to notice that in here, at no point does he mention the name of Dave Arneson. So he says D&D was designed, developed when Guidon Games was a thriving entity, and they didn't want to publish it. He tried to get them to do it, but they didn't want to do it. And then they kind of ceased active publishing. So then he goes to Avalon Hill and they turn it down. And so, he's looking at all these other companies to publish the game, and nobody's interested. And so he decides that, okay, that's fine. I'm going to do it myself. And so, other people were saying like, this fantasy thing is like a fluke. It's a fad. It's going to go away. You should focus on, war games and things like that, like miniatures war games. And that's not what Gary's doing at this point. And so he says he's got D&D and Dungeon. So he does mention the game Dungeon, created by Dave McGarry, one of Dave Arneson's friends and a member of the Minnesota gaming group. But he's like, I knew that they were saleable commodities. So having aspirations of forming my own wargaming company anyway, okay, that's fine. I mean, I don't know if we know that he wanted to do this before he got turned down, but he basically says they created tactical studies rules and they published D&D second. The second title published of that firm was D&D. So he says, Don K., Brian Bloom, and I staked the whole of our company on this venture, and it took every bit of capital they had to produce the game. So that seems to have been, pretty much the case. To the point where, and again, I've talked about this before, but Don K. had to cash out a life insurance policy to help publish and print Dungeons and Dragons and get it distributed. And then unfortunately, he dies of a heart attack less than a year later, very out of the blue. He was super young, just hadn't unfortunately taken care of himself physically very well. And because he'd cashed in that life insurance policy, it really had an impact on his family, because they weren't able to have the life insurance policy because he'd cashed it in. So there was some bitterness there when he passed away from his surviving family members, especially his wife. From what I understand, at least. So, but he talks about, they spent hundreds of hours writing it for print, and hours that we could not spend gaming or with our families or in pursuit of some other form of relaxation and enjoyment. Long, hard work done late into the night on the weekends, but there was nobody but the three of them. They were doing it by themselves with no help, and they got the game out and they sold 1,000 copies in a little less than a year, I think he says. And then the next group of 1,000 copies sells in a little under 6 months. So that's good background to understand. Gary put his heart and soul into doing this. And so I think it's very natural. And when I've watched some other documentaries, or I've listened to, there's the podcast, When We Were Wizards, was really helpful with this. Just understanding how important the success of D&D was to Gary and his family, knowing that Gary came from a poor family, to the point where his wife was growing vegetables to sell so that they could help pay the bills and pay the mortgage and things like that. Gary had been let go from his job, been laid off. And so he needs this to succeed. And the thought that someone might take it from him and use, his intellectual property to create something was a big deal to him, because he was doing this, partly for ego. He wants to make a name for himself in the gaming community, but he also needed this to succeed so that he could keep his house and put food on the table for his kids. So it is understanding kind of his viewpoints, I think, when you take it from that context. But then he said, but then on the event, D&D grows, and they did supplements to fill in the thing. And then he goes on to say, like, we could have printed as many supplements as we wanted, and all of them would have sold, because people were just going to buy anything that had D&D on it. And he said, like, we chose not to do that. We only put out the ones that we thought, were important and that had something to say. And he's like, some of them were better than others. And I've always wondered if that was sort of a dig at Blackmore, because I think, from what I understand, Gary and specifically Tim Kask did not like the Blackmore supplement. I don't know that that's true. That's just my supposition, like reading between the lines here. But he basically says, like, everything they put out, like, they think is quality, just, some better than others, but they could have done way more and they chose not to. And then he said, while imitation's the sincerest form of flattery, in this case, he kind of just doesn't think it is, because foolish imitations are demeaning, and they basically sully the name of Dungeons and Dragons, is what he's saying here. So he's not really happy that all these people are kind of, they're making money and making sales based off of something that he created, and he doesn't get anything out of it originally. So he talks about how he's going to be redoing Dungeons and Dragons to make it into advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that that's interesting as well. So the section here where he talks about the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, I think the wording on this is very interesting, especially considering what Gary's going to say later. But he says that 2 years ago, so I'm over here in the second paragraph on the far right-hand column, and about halfway down, he says, 2 years ago, we determined to revise the whole of D&D in order to clean up the errors and fill in the holes. The project is a long and complicated one, a task not accomplished overnight. Some players have impatiently demanded immediate release of such material, but we are not about to step into that mess again. D&D originally came out as it did because of demands from those who had tested it and had fallen in love with the concept. So then he says basic D&D was the first step, and the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual is the next. And then he talks about making the next 2 volumes, which might be out by the next summer. We know that's not going to be the case. It's going to be 2 years from now before the Dungeon Master's Guide comes out. And then, but he says, we recognize that D&D is a true innovation. Now, the reason I think that wording is interesting is because later on, Gary, of course, is going to claim that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is a wholly new and different game that has nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. And he does that due to the lawsuit from Dave Arneson about royalties. But in here, he essentially says that, again, we determined to revise the whole of D&D, and he includes Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in that category of revising the game, which to me means it's not a brand new game, it's a revision. But of course, Gary's going to later on claim, no, it's a revision. So then he says, now I'm down here at the last paragraph on the right-hand side. He says, quite a few individuals and firms have sought to cash in on a good thing by producing material from or for D&D. So material from D&D, of course, would be the Dungeon Master's Index. That's one of the things that would be talking about. Others have parodied the game, and that for most of these efforts, TSR has only contempt for saying that we are sometimes taken to task quite unjustly. I suppose that that's to be expected from disgruntled people who are prevented from making a fast and easy buck based on their labor, their work. And or from those persons responsible for cheap imitations whose work we rightly label as such. But then he goes on saying, I think this is really interesting. He says they're not upset about their game being inspirational for people creating new things, that just not trying to bank on the D&D name. And so he points out On Guard by Games Design's Workshop as a game that he thinks is quite excellent. He says it's an excellent game, and I admire the applications of role-playing which they devise. So I talked about On Guard before in my video where I covered the 4 role-playing games that debuted in 1975. That was one of the 4. And then he says, likewise, Traveler, also by Game Designers Workshop, is an imaginative game. And if it was inspired by D&D, then he says, I consider that pretty cool. Like, that's a good thing. All right. It says TSR respects GDW, Game Designers Workshops, as an ethical concern, which simply saw the possibilities inherent in role playing, and then went on to devise unique and interesting games from that concept. And he says, in fact, there can be no doubt that D&D in particular, and the success of other fantasy and science fiction games from TSR in general, was the prime motivation for many miniatures firms to begin production of figurines in the genre. So that's another thing that he's totally fine with, is like these companies making miniature figures that could be used with D&D, because that's a completely separate thing. It's not trying to steal money away from TSR. So he goes on in this article to talk about, he's like, are we suggesting or are we suppressing competition when we turn down schemes to compile or rehash copyrighted D&D material into some form which will be printed and sold by another firm? So again, that is very clearly about the Dungeon Master's Index. He's not going to mention it by name. He's not going to mention Dave Arneson, but that's what he's talking about. And so he says, no, not hardly. So he says, first, it is our material. Second, the proposed works have been of questionable value to players anyway, although their profitability to their publishers is unquestioned. It is surprising that we do not wish to lend our name or the Dungeons and Dragons name to quote unquote supplemental books which have little or no need, which further confuse and diffuse the methods of playing D&D. TSR desires to maintain quality and consistency of play in D&D. We know the limits of the game and how best to expand the parameters without sacrificing uniformity from campaign to campaign. Imagination and variety are desirable, but 1,000 variant games are anathema. Furthermore, we will not lend our name to accessory products which we do not find to be of high quality. We've spent thousands of dollars advertising the game. Thousands of hours have gone into its development, handling, and growth. We're entitled to a just profit from such expense and effort. So Dave Arneson is going to publish the Dungeon Master's Index. It does come out, and it comes out by a company called Heritage Models. That's who he works with to publish it. And he says in the introduction of that book, Dave Arneson does, that because the D&D game continues to grow, he supposes that there's no other recourse except to consider this the first volume in a series of what will become a series of these Dungeon Master Indices books that come out. It is going to be the only one. There's not a huge print run. It's one of those kind of like things that people sort of have forgotten about, but it's the first thing Dave really publishes after he leaves TSR. He was already kind of, I think, from what I understand, sort of working on the idea. And it was a quick way for him to kind of get back into the role-playing game community and keep his name out there, and also try to establish a little bit of ownership rights of him. That, like, him putting this out there is basically saying, like, he has the legal right to put it out there because he was one of the co-creators. So, I mean, whether he directly says that or not, that is kind of the implication. Now, it does mention Dungeons and Dragons by name in the introduction of that book, but he says it's a registered trademark of TSR and things like that, so he does mention that. But there are going to be no further Dungeon Master Index books by Heritage Models, and as far as I'm aware, I think this is the only thing that Dave does, like big thing that Dave does with Heritage Models before he tries to doesn't try. He does eventually start his own gaming company in the early 1980s and publishes Adventures in Fantasy, which is also not going to last for very long, unfortunately. So that was sort of like hit. I think people were expecting a lot of that, and that could be a whole other video to talk about that game. Okay, but this whole section here is Gary basically complaining that book shouldn't be allowed to be published. And then he goes on to talk about how Judges Guild's products now have TSR approval, and they review all material which bears the D&D logo before it's published by them. So that's going to be like one of the only companies at this time that TSR's licensed their material to and said, like, yes, you can publish things to say that it's compatible with Dungeons and Dragons. And then, so this is like probably one of the most famous parts of this editorial is over here. I'm again on the left-hand column, and I'm the second from the last paragraph. He says, I cannot resist the analogy of a lion standing over its kill. The vultures scream and the jackals yap when the lion drives them off without allowing them to steal bits of the meat. Perhaps the hyena will manage to successfully grab off a mouthful, but that is all. Other lions may also prey upon the same herd and make even bigger kills, but that is the law of the land. Pardon me, please, if you find the picture not to your liking. From my end, it seems most apropos, for I hear a good deal of screaming and yapping. TSR was the lion which brought down the prey, and we intend to have the benefits derived therefrom. If we share it with anyone, it will be on our terms. The hunter which fails to bring down its kill dies itself. And then he says, so to reinstate our position, TSR doesn't object to honest competition, but they're not going to praise their imitators, and they're not going to try to drive them out of business because they're too busy running the company. So he's kind of turning around and basically saying, oh, we're too big to be bothered by these guys, after he's spent a whole article here complaining about people imitating them. But he says, we're not going to permit individuals or companies to make unauthorized use of our materials. If changes and additions are in order, we believe that we're more capable than others of doing it. And then he says that's why we had J. Eric Holmes, Professor Holmes, do the basic set. And then it's continuing on page 30, and I'm going to go ahead and just flip over there now so we can finish this article up. So it's just short paragraph here, the one after the under the line on the left-hand side. He says, on the other hand, as the persons who pioneered the whole fantasy role-playing game concept, okay, that's debatable, and we've talked about that before with, Dave Wesley's Bronstein. But whatever. The designers and developers of D&D, the best-selling game in its field, we hold to our rights and also believe in our ultimate ability to maintain our premier position with the respect of new fantasy and science fiction role-playing games. The test of all this, however, will come down to the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Gamma World, and various other projects still some time off as of this writing. The final arbiter of all this matters, such matters is the consumer, because he's basically telling you if you don't buy it, then people will stop making it. So the next time someone complains about TSR not allowing them to publish or produce some D&D related item, perhaps you should ask that individual why he or she doesn't create their own game instead of trying to steal what is the property of another. So that's Gary on the very offensive, taking the offensive is what I mean. I don't mean he's being offensive, although you might think that. All right, so now we're going to go back to that article, and then, great. This is perfect advertising placement. He's talking about how Judges Guild is licensed to produce materials for Dungeons & Dragons. TSR is giving them approval. And then, of course, you have an ad here in this right-hand column of the left-hand page for Judges Guild. Creators of play aids approved for use with Dungeons & Dragons, even uses the Dungeons & Dragons logo. So, and then it talks about, all the different things that they have available as of this time. All right, so that's going to wrap up that article, and then we're going to go to this next article here in a second. So this article over here on the right, a D&D variant, Brawling, the Easy Way Out in D&D. So this is by Rob Kuntz, and we've talked about Rob before, but he's one of the original guys. Like, he was with Gary Gygax helping run games in Greyhawk, which was sort of Gary's version of Blackmore before Dungeons & Dragons was ever even condensed into like the 3 booklets and published. Gary was playtesting at Greyhawk was his way of doing that. And Rob Kuntz used to take turns DMing, they didn't call it DMing, refereeing Greyhawk with Gary Gygax. So, and he helped write some of the early supplements that were published. And we're going to talk about that in a minute as well. But this is an article, and it's going to be the first of 2 articles that you're going to see across these 2 magazines that we're talking about, where for some reason there was a desire to create an entirely different combat system for a specific type of combat. And basically what Rob Kuntz talks about in here is like, brawling has always been left up to the respective referee to determine. And he's like saying, that's not satisfactory. We need a system for how to have hand-to-hand combat, like brawls. And I've never understood that. And if you've played, like, I remember in my 3.5 days, or 3E 3.5, and even in Pathfinder, the first edition Pathfinder, the rules for grappling and stuff were so cumbersome. They were so annoying. And I know Pathfinder tried to make it streamlined, and I feel like I don't think it made it worse. I just think it did it differently, and it was still just as bad. For whatever reason, the idea of having hand-to-hand combat in D&D seems to want people to create these like elaborate subsystems rather than just, punching with your fists and doing damage that way and move on. So, and I'm sure a lot of people love this kind of stuff. I think it's really unnecessary. It says it's a variant. I just don't really think it adds anything. I think it adds more to looking up tables, which is going to slow down the combat just for the sake of having a system specifically designed just for unarmed combat, essentially, and grappling. So there you go. All right, now this article here, how do you stop that thing? Or defending against the ogre. Now, this is by Tony Watson, and Tony is going to end up writing quite a few reviews. Going to do quite a few reviews for Dragon and some other magazines as well. But also did an article in Dragon Magazine number 8, which we have talked about before. It was also repeated in the Best of Dragon Volume 1, which was the development of towns in D&D. And it is one of my favorite early articles because it has information that's applicable to any fantasy role-playing adventure game that you're going to play. It has no mechanics that are really specific to D&D. It's just good advice for how to run towns. So I like that thing by Tony. I wish he'd written more things like that rather than just kind of settling into just writing reviews. Not that there's anything wrong with reviews, but I liked his game design philosophy. But in any case, I think this article is really interesting because if you read it, it says like defending against the ogre, and you might be wondering like, why does he say the ogre? So this is actually, it's not a review, but it's a strategy guide for the game Ogre, published by Metagaming and later by Steve Jackson, the American Steve Jackson games. But never, ever in this article does it tell you that that's what this is for. It never says this is a strategy guide for playing the game Ogre. It just jumps in and you have to you would have to know what he's talking about, or else you would just be completely confused as to what is going on here. Trying to halt the armored monstrosity called, and not affectionately, the ogre is not an easy and seldom learned quickly. Again, if you've never played or even heard of ogre, you might be wondering what the heck he's talking about. And I just think that's really interesting. It's just very, very indicative of this kind of like early Wild West kind of stage of these different fan magazines for these different games that were coming out. Was that there's not a lot of I don't want to say there's no editorial control. Obviously, Tim Cass was editor, but had I been an editor on this, I'd have been like, we need to put something in here that tells people what this is for. But it never does. Okay, so we've seen this tiny little ad down here for Lyle's Hobby and Craft Center before. And then over here you have Fantac Games, Space Marines. We have talked about that one before, just from the ad, very briefly, just mentioned it from a previous issue. And then they have yet another game, Orbit War. And so it's a board game for 2 to 4 players. The basic game, advanced game, tournament game give 3 different levels of complexity, a planetary invasion scenario. So you're going to start to see a lot of this in this crop of issues from Dragon Magazine. More and more companies publishing, for whatever reason, science fiction, board games, strategy games that are designed for 2 to 4 people. This is going to be the first of a few that we're going to see. And we know we've already seen Space Marines, which is miniature rules, but it still fits within that genre. Okay, so over here, we're finishing on the left-hand side, the left column, the Ogre Strategy Guide. And then it says at the very bottom, editor's note. So this is where Tim gets his say in what this is about. It's highly recommended that any person desiring to master this intriguing and challenging game beg, borrow, or steal, figuratively speaking, of course, a copy of the Space Gamer number 12. It's full of ogre articles, but the one by Steve Jackson bears special scrutiny. So talks briefly about that. Then it talks about how they're looking for game reviewers, but that they won't provide the game for you. You have to buy it yourself, but they will pay the standard rate. It doesn't tell you what the standard rate is, but it says they'll pay for that. All right. And then over here I'm on the left-hand page, the right-hand column, middle column, I guess you could call it, The Play's the Thing by Thomas Fillmore. This is another article that gets repeated in Best of Dragon Volume 1. But basically this one is, it's about how to kind of improve your role-playing. So Thomas Fillmore is going to write, articles in Alarms and Excursions, in Dungeoneer, a few other magazines like that. That's kind of like the gist of his role-playing game career, as far as I could tell. But this particular article is essentially what it says is don't get stuck in the rut of just playing your own player personality. Don't use your real life personality and just put that onto every character that you run. Every character should be different. And it talks, so we're 1977 here, and he talks about creating a background as to why your character acts the way that he does. And maybe they have a drinking problem, or they chase women, or they're brave or greedy or tricky, or all those kinds of things. And it's just funny because people take that for granted now. Of course, your character's going to have a personality that, might be different from your real life one. Doesn't have to be, but, he talks about he uses the word background very specifically. And I think it's funny because I know a lot of people complain that, people write too much backstory for their character. And, I think, a few sentences is a good back. I don't need 3 pages, but I'm okay having a little backstory if it gives someone a hook to roleplay their character. And he talks about the other thing he talks about in here is that you shouldn't use knowledge from a previous character and what that character knew when you create a new character. And specifically, you shouldn't take revenge on that previous character. And so I think he's getting into player versus player here. So if another player character kills your player character, you shouldn't create a new player character and then immediately go take revenge on the other character that killed your previous character, because the new character wouldn't know that had happened. Very, very specific to this period of time of playing. It's just, it's interesting. But, people liked it enough that, again, it got picked up in Best of Dragon Volume 1. So, then it talks about next month an excerpt from Quag Keep, Andre Norton's new D&D novel. We'll talk about that later. An ad over here for Archive Miniatures, Star Rovers. So you're seeing, again, more science fiction coming through. And this is from Games Workshop. Okay, Seal of the Imperium, the gist of this, I have talked about this before. I think this is the second time we've seen this article show up in Dragon. But this is basically, if you're familiar with Sage Advice, which is answering questions about D&D, questions that come up that people can't answer. They would write in, and there was an article called Sage Advice that would answer that. That's essentially what this is. So Seal of the Imperium is the Sage Advice, the question and answers for Empire of the Petal Throne, and it's by M.A.R. Barker. And again, if you remember that one of those previous issues, Tim Kask says, anytime you see an article written by the person who also created the game, that means it's official. So the implication again here is that these questions that M.A.R. Barker's answering when he's giving game mechanics that could be interpreted in the game, or even if it's just, flavor text or whatever, that is now officially part of EPT. So there's things in here about level limits or gaining experience points for non-human characters. There's a little bit of discussion about why is it so difficult for players to attain really high levels. And he basically says because he thinks lower level play is more fun, it's more dynamic, and there's more going on there. And so he specifically designed it to be difficult to move up in levels. Things that people still talk about today in role-playing games, especially if you play early editions of the game and you're used to that low-level play. And that's very contrary to the way a lot of people say play. And this is not a dig, it's just an observation. I've seen so many people say the first 2 levels in D&D, with 5th edition or, the new 5 point, whatever you want to call it, that came out, 5.24, 2024, it doesn't matter. But people say the first 2 levels are useless. So just start at 3rd level. And I've seen so many people say that why would you play 1st and 2nd level? There's nothing going on with those levels. You don't get any of your good stuff until 3rd level. And I am not one of those people. I always love playing 1st and 2nd level characters because I think that's when you figure out who your character is and what they can do. And that's essentially what M.A.R. Barker is saying here. Now, this is interesting over here on the right-hand side. You see this ad for, it says Imperium. It's very difficult to read. I'll try to increase the size. Whoops. So that we can see it a little bit better. So this is an ad for this company called Imperium. Very specifically, Imperium Publishing Company. And what that is, it's a company that was actually created by a former player in the EPT games run by Professor Barker. So he, one of his players, and his name was Gary, I think it was Gary. Gary Rudolph. So he ended up creating this company. And what this ad here is for is you see there's that the Tecumseh Journal. That's that kind of script, fancy script writing over here on the right hand side. So he is going to end up publishing some stuff for Tecumseh through this company and the world of the Empire of the Petal Throne. And then you also see this thing here called Netherworld. This is essentially it's 3D pieces that you can use to create it's not quite 3D, but you're creating maps. You're creating maps for your role playing games, and it was very expensive at the time for what it was, and so it doesn't last very long. But it's kind of this early idea of like creating your map. That was going to look really cool, thick cardboard printed, it says, on both sides with doors and pits and arches and stairs and things like that. So rather than drawing it out, you're using these professionally produced pieces. Now, one of the interesting things I wanted to point out about this company down here, this ad that you see for Imperium, most specifically the Imperium Publishing Company. Now, again, we talked about how they are publishing things like the TechML Journal, which is coming out. Now, that's interesting because it says 24 pages of art and articles on Professor M.A.R. Barker's fantasy world of TechML. And so we know that TSR published the Empire of the Petal Throne role-playing game in 1975. I have a whole video where I talk about that. Well, what's interesting, remember at the beginning of this video, kind of at the beginning when I read that article by Gary Gygax, where he talked about all these other companies and what they were publishing and who owns rights to what? Well, what's going to start happening, and it's probably starting to happen now, late 77. It's definitely going to come to a head in 78. But Professor M.A.R. Barker and Gary Gygax are going to end up having a disagreement over who owns the rights to Empire of the Petal Throne, but also related things coming out by Professor Barker for the world of TechML. So Professor Barker had this whole thing planned where he was going to have, articles, and this, was going to have a journal, and he was going to have miniatures, and there was going to be miniature war games, and there was going to be like novels. He wanted to write fiction novels, all taking place within his fantasy world of TechML. And he believes that he should be able to do that. He's the creator. But remember, Gary's made people sign documents saying that anything that you create while you are employed by TSR is the property of TSR. Now, M.A.R. Barker was never employed by TSR, at least as far as I know. They just published the game for him. So, it was like the second game, depending on how you want to count things, it's the second, third, or fourth game that TSR publishes, role-playing game that they publish. So, but they published that game. And so Gary is trying to make the case that, well, because they published that game, and Professor Barker agrees, like, they own the rights. TSR owns the rights to the Empire of the Petal Throne role-playing game. But he's saying they don't have the rights to anything else that he creates because he's creating that on his own. And Gary is disagreeing with him. And now Gary's going to end up losing the argument. He didn't really have any, I don't think, had any legal grounds to stand on for that. But it's going to sour the relationship between these two gamers. And Professor Barker is going to end up severing his relationship with TSR. And he's going to start publishing new content for Empire of the Petal Throne and other TechML related things through this company here, Imperium Publishing Company, created by one of his players from his Empire of the Petal Throne campaign. So once you know that that's going to happen, I think it's just really telling that you see this ad printed here at the bottom of this article that he's writing about his game, because it's almost like sort of, it's like predicting what's going to happen. Now, it's very possible that at this point they've known what's going to happen. My understanding is that fallout didn't finally happen until 1978, but I'm assuming the writing was on the wall at this point. So later on, TSR does have some leftover stuff that they of Empire of the Petal Throne and related things, and they basically just they advertise it basically just to get rid of it. And moving forward, M.A.R. Barker's not going to publish any more of his content through TSR. So kind of a sad end to an era, I guess, of this game that was, again, kind of considered one of the first role-playing games ever published after Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so I thought you guys might enjoy that history, but let's move on here. So this is the last part of the article here in the left-hand column. And then you have this right-hand column here on the left-hand page, convention schedule. I think it's interesting when you just look at the kinds of games that are being played. So this is 1978 coming up, and you can kind of tell, just as an example, Winter Fantasy 2. So this is held in Lake Geneva. And if memory serves, I think this was organized by Rob Kuntz. And look at the games listed here. D&D, Warlocks and Warriors, Dungeon, Legion of the Petal Throne, Metamorphosis Alpha, Longmar, Star Probe, Star Empires. I have a whole video where I talk about Star Probe and Star Empires. I'll put a link up here. And then the Dragon Magazine game, Snit Smashing, Snit's Revenge, Boot Hill, those are all TSR games. So that's how they lead on this. They're saying you're going to play TSR games. Well, it's held in Lake Geneva. Now, I don't believe that this was sponsored by TSR. It could be, but I don't think it was. I think it was, quote unquote independent. But it's interesting that they talk about that. But then you go to the very next one down here, the MIT CSC. So the MIT WinterCon 6 in Massachusetts, and it does lead with Dungeons and Dragons, as most of these do, because it was so popular. So you look at Orcon doesn't even mention what games are going to be played, but the fourth one down, Winter War 5, Dungeons and Dragons is the first thing they mention. Warcon 4, they mentioned D&D, second after Kingmaker. But going back up to WinterCon 6 in Massachusetts, so featuring Dungeons and Dragons, but then Victory in the Pacific, Napoleonics, Third Reich, Russian campaign, going back to those traditional war games. They only call out Dungeons and Dragons. So it's just kind of an interesting, again, a point in time. We have an ad over here for a game called Starship and Empire. Again, I was talking about, you're going to see not tons, but it's a very common thing that you're going to start seeing in this era of Dragon Magazine is these small, 2 to 4 player science fiction board games or strategy games. So it says the new space war game. So gather your starship in fleets, all caps, to scout the enemy and invade through hyperspace. So this is from R Squared Games in Salt Lake City, Utah. As far as I could find out, I believe that this was the only game ever published by R Squared Games. And, it doesn't really have much of a legacy other than, they took out an ad in Dragon, which, probably wasn't cheap. I forget what the ad rates were, but, when you amortize or when you look at how much it costs versus $24, for a company like this that's going to end up only publishing one game, that was probably a substantial portion of their, advertising budget. Okay, but then over here you have from the Chronicles of Imaj the Rotund on the derivation of snit subspecies. So this is basically an article that's just going to go with that game Snit Smashing that came out before and is going to be related to the Snit's Revenge, which we're going to see later in this issue. And then you see down here in the bottom right-hand corner, these Snit Smashing notes and errata. So for that game. So this game, obviously very popular. It begat a sequel game or a companion game, and also was big enough that people wanted to see the errata for this game. So this is going to kind of presage things to come of Dragon Magazine publishing games, and then later on it's going to start publishing adventures. Until then, much later on in the 80s, there's a split off, and they split into Dungeon Magazine, which is just going to be all adventures, and they're going to stop publishing adventures in Dragon. But we've got almost a decade before we get there. All right, so now over here on the left-hand page, you have From the Sorcerer's Scroll by Rob Kuntz again. Now, this is interesting, and this is actually something I'd forgotten about because I always associate the article, which it was a column that was free, it was published, for a while. It was published in almost every issue of Dragon Magazine, and I associate From the Sorcerer's Scroll with Gary Gygax. There was a point in time where he was copywriting it, and that's where he was debuting things like new character classes that were official as opposed to being NPC classes, and he was debuting new spells and new mechanics and things like that. But the first one is actually going to be by Rob Kuntz. We talked about him just a few minutes ago. And basically what he's talking about here is he's essentially just kind of recapping what's going on with the game. That's, within the world of Dungeons and Dragons, what's happening. And so he talks about TSR's latest project is going to be the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Monster Manual. I keep saying Dungeon Master Guide. It's going to be the Monster Manual. And he says, as I write this, the printers are having difficulties with it, but it should be around shortly. And as conceived by Gary Gygax with stupendous art by Dave Sutherland, Dave Trempier, and Tom Wam, and extensive editing by the boys at TSR. So basically he talks about it being the biggest achievement from TSR since the publication of Empire, the Petal Throne. So again, if you've seen that video, that was a really nice looking, for the time box. It was very expensive. Empire the Petal Throne was $25 as opposed to D&D, which was just $10. So it was a big deal. And he's saying that this is going to rival that in terms of quality. And then he says Brian Bloom is making an outdoor map for D&D, and he's an accredited author, and he did all the map graphics for the Little Bighorn and the Lankmar games that they've published. And then they're working on new Monster and Treasure matrices for levels 7 through 9. And then they're still trying to figure out the final release date for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So they know when of course, Monster Manual is coming out, but at this point they don't know when the other two books are going to come out. But he talks about some of the changes that are being made, like changes in hit points are happening. The magic system is changing. So he's going through like some of the things that you're going to see coming up. And then he talks a little bit about, Judges Guild is saturating the market with new variants, new material, cave formations and keen sighting and determining types of ruins and all that kind of stuff. But he says it's in cooperation with TSR, and that he says, there have been attempts made to rival D&D. And then he says the closest yet may be Fantasy Game Unlimited. So usually you would just call that FGU, but he writes it out. Chivalry and Sorcery. Which is jam-packed work that does well in its presentation mechanics, but falls short due to its smallish print. But it's a notable success nonetheless. So that's interesting that he's kind of complimenting that game. And if you've played Chivalry and Sorcery, I'd love to hear about it. That's a game I remember seeing ads all the time, but I've never seen it in the wild, so to speak, at a game store at the time. And I've never played it, but I know it's popular with a certain group of people. So drop a note. Let me know what you think about it. And then he talks about, D&D Abroad and the relationship with the Games Workshop. And then he basically says, these are the things that we can cover. And this little part here where it says rate 0 to 9. And he's asking you to write back and tell him, rate each one of these things from a scale of 0 to 9. Of course, it's not going to be 1 to 10. That's too easy. Let's rate it on a 0 to 9. And I've always wondered, I'm assuming he did that just because it ties into how dice were numbered at the time. But I just thought it was so goofy that he couldn't have just done a simple 1 to 10. But he wants you to give them a score, and then they'll know what to include. And so, he's taken a guess as to what you might want to see: new magic items, non-player classes, player classes, combat system, fighter or magical, psionic additions, artifacts, how to map, and then other things like give your suggestions, but question and answer, new monsters, new gods and demigods. All right, more ads here. Whoops. So this is for things like Evermist. Sorry, my screen's going all crazy. Fictioneers, Fantastic Sci-Fi Warriors. And then there's an ad here for this convention that's coming up in Jacksonville, Florida, Gen Con South, and where to contact to get hotels and information like that. So that is going to be that section. And then we're going to get into this big the big thing for this issue, which is this publication of the story Sea Magic by Fritz Leiber. So remember, this was the big thing that was being announced for this issue. This is Sea Magic. It's a short story by Fritz Leiber, and this is actually the debut of this story. So this is a continuing story in his Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series that debuts here in Dragon Magazine in 1977. It's eventually going to be collected into, I think it's the 7th collection of books called The Knight of Knaves and Swords. But that's not going to come out until 1988. So for over 11 years, the only place where you could read this installment in Fafhrd and Grey Mouser was in this issue of Dragon Magazine, which is pretty cool. And it kind of helps to provide context for why Tim Cass kept going on and on about how cool it was that they got this. And it is cool. I mean, this is an awesome thing to have. It's just, I think as time goes on, we start to associate Dragon Magazine more with gaming content and less with fiction. Fiction's going to last all the way up through, at least through the 80s. I forget at what point they dropped the fiction. But, people complained about it. Incessantly people, and you've already seen it. You've seen some of those early letters in Out on a Limb where people are saying the fiction's pointless, get rid of it. I don't want any more of this. And Tim wrote a really scathing article where he said reading fiction will help you become a better dungeon master, just like he says in the beginning of this issue. And so you should be lucky that we have this. Is essentially, I'm paraphrasing, he doesn't exactly use those terms, but this is a really interesting story. It's got pirates and it's got treacherous seas and sorcerers and all kinds of stuff in it. And, it's classic sword and sorcery fiction. And it's going to last for most of the remainder of this issue. You have an ad here from Raul Partha for new miniatures that they're producing. And again, more content with regard to the story. You have an 11th hour shopping guide. So remember, this is the December issue. So the editorial people at TSR Periodicals decided to write a thing of different things that you can get. And what I appreciate about this is that it's not only TSR games. So he talks about the War of the Ring, Middle-earth game. But he also talks about, well, there's basic Dungeons and Dragons, of course, but he's got Judges Guild stuff. He's got Cosmic Encounters. He's got, just a variety of different games here. Ogre, we just talked about that from Metagames, and Snit Smashing. And then he's got some miniatures. He's got family games. So I thought it was kind of cool that there was a variety of different things, and it didn't just focus on TSR, because that's what Tim Kask wanted. Again, if you've seen this series before, he very, very, very much did not want this magazine to become what they call a house organ, where they only talked about games that TSR produced. Eventually, it isn't going to become that, but it's going to be a while. I mean, it's, again, at least up through the 80s where they were covering other games. Might have even been early 90s. So this is Fantasy Forge, where they just talk, it's just pictures and then a list of new miniatures that have come out. And, okay, so you remember me talking about this. This is the second in these articles. This is Quarterstaff Fighting Rules by James Ward. Now, I have a whole video dedicated to James Ward that I made the week after he passed away earlier this year. And it kind of talks about his legacy and gaming community. And I think, the two big things I would guess most people would know him for would be Gamma World. And, also part of that would be Metamorphosis Alpha. I kind of combine them together when I think about them, and then the deities and demigods. But he did so much more, obviously, and you'll want to check out that video to kind of hear more about his legacy in the role-playing game community. But in this article, he basically says quarterstaff fighting should have its own rules. We don't want to use the regular D&D combat because quarterstaff fighting was taken to its highest form in medieval England. And so these rules are going to reflect some of the skill and art of that, what he calls bruising sport. And so, again, this need or this desire to create different systems to sort of make the thing that you like better than just regular D&D combat. It's just, and it, I know I'm picking on this, but Rob Kuntz did it with the unarmed combat, the grappling. James Warren's going to do it with quarterstaff fighting, and you're going to continue to see this. This is a hallmark of this era of D&D design, is people trying to create better combat systems for the thing in combat that they like the best. So you're going to see new systems for archery at a certain point, just all kinds of stuff, right? So this, look at this. It's at least 2 pages. And, a lot of that is he's replicating or showing you what characters from the mythology of Robin Hood, how they would fight in this system that he's created. And again, nothing against James. I just find this system completely unnecessary. Just use the regular D&D combat rules. There's no reason not to. Okay, we've talked about this Cosmic Encounters game ad before, so I'm going to skip past that. So now we have Wormy over here on the left by David Trampier, of course. And then we have the return of Phineas Fingers, Fred and Charlie counterattack, or Dorothy goes off to see the wizard. So I really liked Phineas Fingers, and I don't remember where I first came across it. By the time I started reading Dragon, which was in, the early 80s, I started with issue number 76. I don't think Phineas was in anymore. So at some point I came across some of the early cartoons, and it's fun. That's all there is to it. Now, this is a really fun article here, or review, as it were. This is NBC's The Hobbit. Now, this is reviewed by Tim Kask. So, The Hobbit debuted late November of 1977 on TV. The Rankin-Bass. This is the Rankin-Bass one, the animated version, and this is the one I grew up with. Watching that is what got me interested in reading the book, The Hobbit, which I eventually read. I borrowed my sister's copy, and I read that a few years later. And then many decades after that, that is the exact book. I still have it. It's technically my sister's, but I have it. I read it to my daughter when my daughter turned 3. That was one of my birthday gifts on the night of her 3rd birthday. I was like, I have a surprise for you. And her bedtime stories, I started reading her The Hobbit. And so I have very fond memories of that. But the whole reason that I read the book was because I saw this Rankin-Bass special on TV, and I thought it was amazing. Now, I was 7 when it came out. So Tim Kask has less kind things to say. He basically says it was not well done. He doesn't like it at all. He counts himself as being a Tolkien person, like not quite a Tolkien scholar, but like close, and or a Tolkien expert. And so he thinks it's very inauthentic. It doesn't match the story, and he doesn't understand why, because they advertised it as being faithful to the story, and then he says it's completely unfaithful. They don't use Beorn, which is a big part of the story. The dwarves are all, he calls them like very much like the same. Like they don't have different personalities. They're presented as cowardly, and he thinks that's stupid. And so he doesn't really like a lot about it. He does go on to say that, the fact that a fantasy show got a primetime slot at all is a big deal. And so he's like, that's just a sign of the times that fantasy is becoming popular. And I think that he's right. I mean, I definitely remember seeing this and being interested in it. And I had not heard of The Hobbit before. I just discovered it, because it was on TV. I mean, back then I think we had 3 or 4 TV stations, and this was one of them. So, but he talks about, they had to compress the action, which he understands because it's a 90-minute show, but he doesn't like the way that they compressed it. He doesn't like the songs. He says they're innovative, but they fall short. And then they take liberties with the story. And so he's not a big fan. Now, critical reviews of this were pretty mixed. I mean, people that are really kind of tied to the fantasy genre pretty much just didn't like it. But people that took a more kind of, objective view that weren't so tied to try to compare it to the source material, but just reviewed it for what it was, basically said it was, it's worth a try. Like, give it a shot and see what you think, because there's some interesting stuff in here. So Tim says, in summary, it is inaccurate, poorly developed, and it's a rehash of one of the finest fantasy novels ever written. And Xerox, who was the sponsor, so this is back in the day when like you'd have a major sponsor, one sponsor for the whole show. My recollection was there was more than just one sponsor in the show, but like Xerox was the big one. Like they got top billing. They didn't get their money's worth, but they did get, however, great Nielsen's. He spells Nielsen wrong, but this is Nielsen ratings that he's referring to. It's Nielsen. I actually tried to look up what the Nielsen ratings were for the show, and I couldn't find it. So I don't know how well it did. But I definitely remember seeing it when it was on TV. And I have a feeling I might have seen it after 1977, because I didn't read The Hobbit until 5th grade, and I was 7 in 1977, so I was not in 5th grade at the time. So I'm guessing that they aired it again. I mean, that would make sense because they put a lot of money into it. They're not only going to just air it once. Now, interestingly, the art is something that some people kind of appreciated. It was reminiscent of some earlier art that was done, like some two-dimensional static art for books and things like that. And they tried to copy that formula. But the studio that did the art out of Japan, that studio ended up kind of like disbanding, but most of the animators went on and it became Studio Ghibli. So it's not like that company became Studio Ghibli, but the animators who were there ended up being brought on board from this studio that created The Hobbit. They ended up creating eventually Studio Ghibli. So that is going to be that for that particular review. There's a cartoon down here on the bottom left-hand side by Tom Wam. It's kind of funny. Like they're talking about playing in the dark, and like the one guy forgot to use glow-in-the-dark paint, so he can't see his minis. And then someone's like, "You can't even see the hit tables." And then someone's like, "What's a hit table?" It's just it's goofy, it's fun, it's very insider. But over here on the right-hand side, so you see a full-page ad by TSR Hobbies Inc. for the release of the Monster Manual. And so they're going all in. This is like now at least the 3rd, if not 4th time that they've mentioned that the Monster Manual is coming out. So it's a compendium of monstrous spirits and minions that no serious Dungeons & Dragons enthusiast should be without. And then it goes in to talk about, like, it's an encyclopedic listing, 350 monsters, alphabetical order. And, it has stuff from creature features appearing in the back issues of Strategic Review and the Dragon. So, if you've watched this series before, you've seen where some of these creatures debuted, and they did debut in either the Strategic Review or the Dragon. like iconic monsters that we just now accept as being part of the game. A lot of them came from these publications. And then they actually reprint the section on the carrion crawler to show you just how comprehensive the listings are. And it has the original artwork of no less than 3 illustrators, which are the same 3 that are on staff here at the Dragon. Dave C. Sutherland III, Dave Trampier, or Tramp, and Tom Wam. And 200 drawings throughout the book. So again, this was a big deal, that the fact that there was a hardcover book being published for a game, that was not something anybody ever thought of before. And TSR was the company that innovated this to decide to move away from, a box or, a small softcover pamphlet and do a hardback book with, full color cover. And it kind of, it changed the direction that the hobby was going to go. It's hard to say whether we would have ended up with hardback books at some point or another, but, they were the first to do the box set with those small little boxes. Traveler is a box set with the small little size booklets, the same size as the booklets in D&D. And all the supplements were those small size. So things like On Guard was that small digest size, like, books being published. And then TSR starts publishing larger size booklets like Metamorphosis Alpha. They publish a larger size box set. And then you see other companies started to publish larger size box sets and things. And then TSR does a hardback book. And then later on, it takes a while because this is a huge investment in terms of, the money that you have to put into this. And so, a lot of companies just didn't have the capital to publish a hardback book. But eventually you're going to see that become, kind of a standard. And so TSR was the first to do that. So that is that ad for the Monster Manual. Now, this over here on the left-hand side, this says Happy Holidays. This is actually the back cover. So the rest of this issue you see here, it says Floating in Timeless Space, is the rules and the game board, board, quote unquote. It's, pulled out of the magazine for Snit's Revenge. So the companion and or sequel game to Snit Smashing. But just the way that it's laid out here in this PDF, you're going to get the back cover over here first. So Happy Holidays from TSR Periodicals, and then they give you the P.O. box in Lake Geneva. And so this was designed by, you can see it down here, it's very faint, but in the bottom right-hand corner, DAT, so David A. Trampier, and or, Tramp, the same artist that does Wormy. And once you know that, you look at this and you can very clearly see, and I mean, the colors are so vibrant, and the design is very much like that. So this is people from TSR Periodicals at the time, like the staff. So you have in the sleigh with the glasses, but sitting down with like kind of turning around, looking at you. I'll put a circle or something around. So that's Gary Gygax. Okay, the person driving the sleigh, also with glasses, turned around with the pipe. And you see that hat. So look at that hat there that you see that's flown off of him, that gray hat. If you ever watch Tim Kask's YouTube channel, he's always got a hat on. Now his hat in the YouTube channel is like a Civil War era Union Army hat, but very classic for him to have that the pipe and everything. So that's clearly Tim Kask on the reins. Now the person sitting very calmly reading the book, that's Jake Jackett, who was one of the associate or assistant editors, whatever the title was, for a while. He is eventually going to become the editor after Tim Kask leaves. Okay, so that's him reading. And then the person with the black hair and glasses, also the beard, who is leaning kind of out of the sleigh and is looking down kind of like he's upset. That's Tom Wam. Now, he's supposed to be looking at, you see this like branch or stick that's down here at the very bottom. So that's his walking stick. And what I saw, and I think this is on Dragon's Foot, people were talking about like who's in this picture, and Tom said that like at this point he had given up driving or given up his car, whatever the case was, and he was using a walking stick, and that was important to him to have that. And so that, he's being seen without his walking stick. It's fallen out of the sleigh. Okay, so now the person on the runner of the sleigh is, I want to say, Dave Sutherland. I wrote all this down as notes, and of course now I can't find my notes as I'm reading to you. Yes, that is Dave Sutherland on the runner of the sleigh, like looking down, kind of nervous, and you can see his paintbrushes and his drawing utensils in his back pocket there. Okay, now the person next to Gary Gygax to the left, who is kind of climbing over the back of the sleigh and trying to grab his hat, that's Dave Trampier. Very classic. That hat was like his thing. Everybody knew him from that hat. So you would automatically know that that's who that is. He's also the artist of this, right? Okay, and then the person with the big smile jumping out of the back, looks like he's got a parachute and he's about to pull a ripcord. That's Rob Kuntz. And then the person, sadly, the only one whose face we can't see, he's falling down, and like, face toward the ground. So that is Joe Orlowski, from the editor of Little Wars. Okay, so just kind of really fun. Again, this would be an awesome piece if anybody ever had gotten one of these in the mail or something. Like what a souvenir to have from back in the day. But that was the back cover of the magazine. And then again, you have here the rules in the game. Like I said, the game board for the game Snit's Revenge. I'm not going to go into the details on that, but again, extremely, extremely popular at the time. And that's going to be our look at Dragon Magazine 11. So now we're going to look at Dragon Magazine number 12. And here we are with Dragon Magazine issue number 12. This is from February of 1978. So remember, at this time, Dragon was being published, well, at this point, 8 times a year. So they skipped January. They went from December of 77 to February of 78. However, starting with this issue, I think, or actually, no, the next issue, which is going to be April, it's going to go to monthly. So in this issue, we have exclusive preview, Andre Norton's forthcoming D&D novel, Quag Keep. And then this art here, and this is again by Elro here. And, once you kind of start to see these in a few different pieces of work, you can start to kind of pick out, like it's not pastel, but just the coloring, the way that the coloring is done on these, it starts to become very clear that's who this is. So super bright yellow background, which might seem like an odd choice, but remember back in the day, part of the job of the cover was to get people to grab it off the newsstand and pick this up. And this is something that's extremely colorful. It's going to be looking different from every other thing that's on the newsstand, hopefully. And, trying to entice you to pick this up and see what it's all about. So that's the cover. Now, we have an ad over here on the left-hand side, Ralph Artha Enterprises, more miniatures that are coming out, an evil wizard, a paladin, a wing lord, kind of a fun idea, and a land dragon with a lancer. And then you have an ad for the basic set, Dungeons & Dragons. So this is the Holmes edition of D&D, and you can see we've talked a little bit about this ad before. I think it's been in there. It's not a great reproduction, but $9.95 for the box set. And then you can see the other things that they had available for sale, including buying a catalog for $2. And then you got $2 off. If you bought the catalog, you got those $2 back if you spent $10 or more. Okay, so now over here on the left-hand side, we have our editorial, Dragon Rumbles, from Tim Kask. And he talks about basically they're going to publish the first time forever. They're going to publish a statement of ownership, management, and circulation. And he just talks about how it's growing and growing. It's now the largest non-house organ in the field, placed only behind the general, strategy and tactics, and moves. And so they're quite satisfied with that, particularly because those other 3 magazines have had a lot longer time to get to where they are. And then he says they're going to increase publishing schedule to monthly. So if you're reading this in February and you're on time, the magazine is also. The cover date of The Dragon, TD13, will be April, and that's where I'm going to start going to a monthly cadence. Okay. And then he also mentions, though, however, that does mean that your subscription price is going to go up from $9 to $18. So that's one of the things that's going to happen. And because he said, like, when they increased their publication before, when they went from 6 issues to 8, they did increase the price. But now that they're going to a full 12 issues, they're going to double the price from 9 to 18. But it's still the same price per issue that you were paying, kind of. So they've been talking about having T-shirts. And so he asked if people are interested in doing that. And then interesting here at the bottom, the last paragraph of his editorial. It says, another project that's been on the drawing board is a reprint of all the best material from the first volume of The Dragon, which are issues number 1 through 6. And also they're going to let the old strategic review go out of print. So there's a good chance that they might go through those and pick out the best material. And so he says, we envision a 64 or 56 page volume, which would sell for about $2.50 to $3. And then he says, if interest is sufficient, let us know. We'll produce it. Of course, interest is going to be sufficient. They're going to do a total of 5 Best of Dragons. So I talked about Best of Dragon Volume 1 before. That was my first in my series of these Dragon Magazine reviews. So over here on the left-hand side, of course, you see the table of contents and also, again, the staff on the magazine, which is the exact same staff that we saw last time, including the cover artist. So same cover artist, two issues in a row. Okay, and then over here on the right-hand side, you have this article, The More Humorous Side of D&D, or They Shoot Hirelings, Don't They? So this is essentially just, it's fun. This is the only thing I could find by Leon Wheeler, the author, in Dragon, as well as in the role-playing game, industry in general. But it's essentially like telling stories about your role-playing game. This funny thing happened, and that's all this is. It's just repeating stories. I told a story, and I think it was my last video. Yeah, it was my last video on like the 5 mechanics that I like the best in role-playing game, or whatever it was. And when I got to Exploding Dice and Savage Worlds, I told this whole story about a disastrous time that I had rolling Exploding Dice. And somebody in the comments was very kind. It was very funny. Said like, I think we all have stories like that. Like everyone's got that story when things just went awfully wrong, and it's fun to tell. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that and weren't bored by it. But that's all this article is. It's just telling funny things that happen. And he talks about one of the things that's interesting is he talks about this cleric who has an intelligence of 7. And so the player plays the cleric like the cleric is just completely brain dead. And it's kind of, that's just an interesting way to look at abilities, because I don't look at it that way. I mean, if you look at if you look at a 3 to 18 scale, 10 is average. So 7 is, it's below average, but it's not a 3. It's not completely out of the realm that you could have a little bit. You're just not quite as bright on the uptake, but whatever. So this whole article is just telling those story. Then you have this article here. This is a D&D variant. Again, this is like a column that they're trying to institute, D&D variants. A new look at Illusionists. Now, this is by Raphael Orval, or hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. But this is another person where I don't think there was much of a role-playing game career other than this specific article. It's the only article that they wrote in Dragon that I can find. And it's basically just a review of how to play an illusionist kind of a little bit smarter, with spell choice and how to use spells. It has some variants of how to adjudicate usage of spells for illusionists versus standard magic users. And then it talks about magic items that an illusionist might use. So it's kind of interesting. This is going to be the last time that we're going to see an article on illusionists. If you remember, the illusionist class debuted in Strategic Review by Peter Aronson, and then there was some updates done in a later issue. I can't remember if it was. I think it was one of the early issues of Dragon, and then Gary Gygax is going to pick that class up and publish it in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook. He's going to thank Peter Aronson in the introduction / forward / whatever. I forget what it was, but. That class was created by someone else, but this is going to be the last time we talk about illusionists before the publication of the Player's Handbook. So this is the publishing statement that Tim Cass was talking about over here on the bottom left-hand corner. And then again, we have that Starship and Empire ad. We talked about that in the last issue just a few minutes ago. And then there is a talk about this, the Spring Revel, which is, like a convention sponsored by TSR Hobbies, Lake Geneva. And so it says, in the spring, a young man's thoughts turn to D&D and Snit's African campaign and fits. So, some game-related humor there. All right, so then you have another D&D variant. This is the Persian Mythos. So this is told in the same, or not told, it's mechanically, it's written in the same style as Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, Supplement 4. So I have talked about that something before. That's in my video on my tribute to James Ward. So that was written by Gods, Demigods, and Heroes was written by Rob Kuntz and James Ward. Just important to remember for later. So Jerome Arkenberg is going to write this on the Persian Mythos. And it says, the ancient Persian religion Zoroastrianism is a dualist system. So interestingly enough, I looked this up because I knew that this was still a thing. So there are, depending on who you ask and like which data you're looking at, between 100,000 and 200,000 people still today, mostly in Iran and India and in North America, who practice Zoroastrianism, where this is like a real religion. And but Jerome is deciding to take this religion and try to translate it into game mechanics. And, this has been a thing that people have talked about over the years of taking things that Western people or non-practitioners of those religions try to turn things and gamify them and turn them into game mechanics. And some people have a problem with that. So, and I can see the point of view. The thing is, Jerome, it's really interesting, is going to write a whole bunch of articles in Dragon about different mythos of different cultures, and does a lot of research. So they're really interesting. I think the problem is, and this is not Jerome's fault, because this is how Gods, Demigods, and Heroes was written. The problem was, in the first place, deciding to apply game mechanics in terms of strength and class levels and hit points to deities, some of which are still worshipped in modern culture, right? So I think if they'd been written more from an historical standpoint, that would have actually even been better, because it would have given you more to work with. Just having a stats like this just makes it look like monsters to be killed. And that's not something that's super useful in the game, unless I guess you're looking for a new monster. But I think more cultural context of like the practices and the rites of these faiths would have been more helpful for like a cleric player character. So it's just the way that you're presenting it. But again, this is going to be the first in a long series of these types of articles that Jerome Arkenberg's going to do. As far as I know, those are the only things that Jerome did for the role-playing game, community or hobby. But they're interesting. We have our ad over here for Wildlands of High Fantasy on the right-hand side, and then the Miniature Figures Limited over here on the left-hand side. And Stellar Wars, once again, fantasy and hobby, sales and manufacturing, another science fiction role-playing game, Interstellar Conflict. So I told you we're going to see a lot of these. So there we go. And then you have an ad over here for Archive Miniatures, which you've seen before in the previous issue. Then you have some thoughts on the speed of a lightning bolt. So this is by James Ward. And essentially what he's saying is, in combat, a magic user can get the drop on a fighter, even though the way that the combat makes it look, the fighter looks like he's much more strong or powerful and would probably win. Even if they have the same dexterity, he writes this whole thing where he does all the math and shows you that a wizard, even without a spell prepared and the same dexterity, as long as neither one is surprised, this kind of thing, the wizard can get the drop on the fighter. And, again, this is going back to, it seems very player versus player. James likes to write a lot of articles like this, where it's like these little tips and tricks, and a lot of them are really good. This one I didn't ever find all that interesting, but there is some, I guess, interesting analysis of the way the D&D combat system works, and like the different segments that happen, so that a magic user could get a spell off before a fighter could kill the magic user, because the magic user obviously has less hit points. Then there's this really short article here, Ship's Cargo by James Endersby and John Carroll. Again, as far as I can find, I think not only is this the only article that they write in Dragon Magazine, I think this is the only thing I could find as far as their history and the role-playing game hobby. But it's a short, quick little thing about how to generate the cargo on a ship so that you know what's on there, and it makes the game more exciting, so that when the player characters come across a ship, there's stuff on there, and the DM, has, or the referee has something to roll really quickly to figure out like what's going on. So and no game mechanics here at all. So super helpful in pretty much any system, and it's like less than a full column. Then you have this article, The Druids by James Bruner. Now, James is going to go on to write another article in the future in Dragon Magazine about the history of the Assassins. And those are going to be the two that I could find that were written in Dragon Magazine. But essentially, this article is about, like it says, it's the history of the Druid. And the editor's note is that it's always been our opinion that the best D&D playing come about when everyone has a feel for what and who his character is. The Druid PC can add a whole new dimension to PC interplay when handled right in a campaign. The following is offers an attempt to offer new avenues of interplay amongst players, for we should learn our best lessons from history and grow and build from there. So this is a real historical overview of Druids. He talks about Julius Caesar's Gallic War and like things like there's misconceptions that the Druids were all about human sacrifice. He's like, that's not really true, and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting. And it does help to kind of help provide context for the Druid class that is in Dungeons and Dragons. So over here on our right-hand side, we're seeing a new ad for Imperium Publishing Company. But again, we talked about that in the last issue. This is going to be the company that's going to, moving forward, start publishing Professor Barker's work for the world of Tekamau. Here's our Fantasy Forge. It's not an ad, it's like a review, kind of. It's editorial of all these new miniatures that have come out and just kind of listing like who makes them and like where to get them. All right. So this is kind of a fun one. This is one of the ones that I mentioned in the teaser trailer or whatever you want to call it at the beginning of the video. But this is the Lovecraftian Mythos in Dungeons and Dragons. So again, this is going to be from the Sorcerer Scroll column, but it is by Rob Kuntz. Now, I just mentioned Rob Kuntz was the co-author of Gods, Demigods, and Heroes with James Ward. And actually on the book, Kuntz's name was listed first. Now, I'm not sure if they just did that alphabetically or what the deal was with that, but he was one of the people that helped that come to be. Now, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes was the supplement that eventually is going to get transitioned into Deities and Demigods for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in 1981. But he talks about here and says, those of you who have read H.P. Lovecraft's stories based around his fallen gods, the Great Old Ones, will know what it means to finally get them into a form which they are understood and compatible with the D&D system. J. Eric Holmes, known for his work with basic Dungeons and Dragons, with additions by my humble self, bring you parts of the Cthulhu mythos. They are laid out to be compatible with Dungeons and Dragons supplement for Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. And for all of you Lovecraft enthusiasts, here's what you've been waiting for. For all of you not familiar with the Cthulhu cycle, here's a new experience. So I really like this. I think it's really fun to see the genesis of what's going to happen with taking these gods, or, mythos, the Cthulhu mythos, and putting this into the first and second printings of the Deities and Demigods book. Because if you recall, there was a little kerfuffle over the rights. And a lot of people mistakenly think that James Ward and TSR just threw it in here without knowing anything and not caring and just hope that things would work out. And I can understand why people think that, because TSR in the early days did have kind of a history of, like, they put hobbits and ents and there's other stuff from Tolkien, but the two I remember off the top of my head would be hobbits and ents that they had to change. So hobbits became halflings and ents became treants, because the people with the Tolkien estate said, no, you can't, those are trademarked by us. And then they also published that game, The Warriors of Mars, using the Barsoom stories, and they didn't have rights to that either. So there's an assumption from a lot of people that they just did the same thing by putting the Cthulhu and then also the Melnibonéan mythos into deities and demigods, but that is not the full story. So James Ward has a whole thing. Just watch my video on James and you'll learn more about like how that happened. But it's not just a case of like they just hoped that nobody would notice, or they didn't know that they needed approval. They actually did have approval but that's a whole other story. Okay, so, but in this case, in this article, no, they they don't have approval for this. At least I don't believe that they did. They don't credit anybody, but they put some really neat things in here, and I really like the descriptions. I like the things that they chose to include in here. So interestingly enough, so if you're familiar with the format of gods, demigods, and heroes, the primary, god of each mythos has 300 hit points and everybody else has less. Now in deities and demigods, it's going to get up to 400, but we're using the 300 baseline. And so Azazoth, creator of the universe, gets 300. And so even somebody like Cthulhu gets only 200. Hastur the Unspeakable, Nyarlathotep is 150. And it just shows you the power creep that we've encountered over the years. Like Nyarlathotep is considered a 15th level fighter, 15th level magic user, essentially. Nowadays that would be considered like, just a regular, average hero. It seems like sometimes. So then it goes on. There's an article in here, or not an article. There's a section in the article about the Necronomicon, the Elder Sign. There's just some cool stuff in here. I really like this. I think, I don't want to say it's more detailed than the stuff that's in deities and demigods, but it's not necessarily 100% overlap. There's stuff in here that's not in that book and vice versa. And, I dig it. I really like this article a lot. I think there's a lot of great ideas in here and kind of how to incorporate some of these ideas into like a standard D&D campaign. Over here on the bottom right-hand side, we see an ad for All the World's Monsters. Now, I have talked about this before. It's in my video on kind of like the early campaign settings that were released. I know it seems like a weird place to put it in a campaign setting book, but or a campaign setting video. But when you watch the video, you'll understand why I threw it in there. I basically cover every game that came out after D&D up until like 1978, I think it was. That was my cutoff point, I think. And then I talk about whether that game had a setting or not. And then if it did have a setting, I covered the setting. And there's a reason why I did that. And it's partly because people said like, I did a previous video on settings. People are like, you forgot about this. You forgot about this. And like, which is fine. I get it. But that's why I did that. So anyway, I have talked about this game briefly before. Okay, so then we have the Editor's Library, sneak preview, the Advanced D&D Monster Manual. So once again, going full bore on talking about the Monster Manual. Now, this is a very short kind of review. It's by Tim Kask, and he says, let me qualify it by explaining I had nothing to do with the design. Like, I had the pleasure of reading the manuscript. He corrected some spelling and punctuation and grammar. And it's interesting. He corrected spelling, punctuation, and grammar, and then he misspells the word grammar, which always tickles me. But then he says, that's the last time I saw it. And then I was knocked out when I saw it from the printers. And so it's now available. It's worth the wait. The finished product is a radical departure from the norm in war game publishing. So again, they're still calling it a war game. So he says it's hardbound. He puts that in all caps, hardbound, stitched, full color cover, alphabetical table of contents, etc. So it's an absolute must. And, they were obviously, and rightly so, very proud of this. And so I think that's kind of cool. But again, they're going full bore into like making sure that that this is available. So this little bit down here where it says Hirelings continued from page 5, that is the article, like the humorous article on humor in D&D. That's the finishing part of that article. All right. And then we have the sneak preview of Quag Keep by Andre Norton. So this was, again, a huge deal because this is going to be so it's a sneak preview because this was going to be published as like a fiction book that you could go buy at a bookstore. So it's published by Anathema Press, I believe. So it's not published by TSR. They were not at this point in time. They were not into publishing fiction. That's not going to come until much later in the 80s. But Andre Norton was originally her name's Alice, and she uses that as her middle name. So Andre Alice Norton. She takes a pen name because at the time, the thought was most fantasy fiction was read by boys, and boys would be more likely to pick up a book written, by a male author than a female author. Very thinking of the time. And so Andre Norton takes on this pen name, and that's what she writes under for pretty much the most of her career. I remember first encountering her because a friend in like middle school, which is when I started to play D&D, when I got introduced to it, was reading Witch World. So in my head, I always associate Witch World with being like the most popular, most famous book by Andre Norton. I don't really know if that's true. It's just kind of the one that I was first exposed to. But this story is going to be the first time that a role-playing game is used as the premise for a story. And that role-playing game is going to be Dungeons and Dragons. So it's also the first Dungeons and Dragons fictionalized story, like for like a fictional novel. And then it's going to be the first time that the world of Greyhawk appears in fiction outside of a game-related context. So it was a big deal that this novel came out. It was also a big deal that they got a famous fantasy author like Andre Norton to write this book. So that happened because Gary Gygax invited her over to his house to play Dungeons and Dragons around, I think it was 1976. And Andre Norton plays D&D with Gary Gygax and some other folks. And then a discussion came up about, wouldn't it be cool to write a book about this? And so she writes it. I always like this story a little bit because if memory serves, and it's been forever, folks, but I believe the main character's name is Martin. So I always got a kick out of that. But that's going to, and so you have this art here by David Tramp, but that's going to take up the majority of the rest of this issue, actually. So it's a long sneak preview, we'll say. Here we have our, again, another cartoon by Tramp for Wormy. And then Phineas Fingers with full color. So that's kind of a departure for Phineas. But just look at how deep and colorful, and it's not the right word to use, but like how rich the colors are in the Wormy on the left. And then look how light and pastel looking. And I'm not making a judgment about one being better than the other. But if you were to just look at these and kind of squint, your eye's going to definitely be drawn to the Wormy side because the colors again are just so rich and deep. Okay, so then you have the finish up of the story, Quad Keep, here on the left-hand side. And then you have coming up, Japanese Mythos. So that's going to be by Jerome Arkenberg. We just talked about that. So there's going to be a whole series of these. And other things coming up, Optional Demon Generation, the Bionic Supplement, ? And then the winner of the first Name That Monster contest, which we have talked about. If you've watched my videos before, you saw that contest announced a few issues ago. Then over here on the right-hand side, a full-page ad for Star Empires. Again, I have a whole video about Star Probe and Star Empires. It was intended to be a trilogy. I think the third game, if I remember, was going to be Star Master, which is never published. Now, very cool thing. They are working on the original person who created this game, John Snyder, is working on doing like the third volume of finally, and I believe it's going to be published by the folks who put out the Secrets of the Secret of Blackmore documentary. So that'll be great when that comes out, if it does, and I hope it does. That would be awesome. But watch my video on that to learn more about the history of this game and why it's so important in the history of role-playing games and science fiction role-playing games specifically. And then here on the last page, you have an ad for the Fantasy Trip. So this is a brand new game. It calls it a role-playing game. It doesn't really become a role-playing game for a little while. I know that was the original intent, but it's really more of like a combat, like man-to-man combat game. So they have the Fantasy Trip Melee and the Fantasy Trip Wizard. Those are kind of like two separate games, but they work together. Published by Metagaming. It's eventually going to be published by Steve Jackson Games when he takes it from Metagaming because he doesn't like the way that they end up publishing what he intended to be a full, complete role-playing game with an adventure and setting and then rules. And my understanding is that Metagaming kind of split it up into like 4 separate parts and published them separately. And Steve Jackson was really upset by that because he envisioned it as a complete game. So eventually he's going to take this and publish it on at his own gaming company, Steve Jackson Games. And just a reminder, everybody, this is the American Steve Jackson. There are 2 Steve Jacksons, and I know a lot of people thought that they were the same person. I did for the longest time, but the English Steve Jackson behind like Games Workshop is a completely separate person. Nothing to do with this person here that we're talking about, Steve Jackson behind Metagaming and Steve Jackson Games. So one of the interesting things about the fantasy trip is that it is, I believe, the first role-playing game that utilizes a point-buy system instead of randomly generating your statistics, your ability scores. And so that is, going to affect the legacy of role-playing games moving forward once you kind of have this, because that's going to become, I don't want to say it becomes the default, but I know tons of people prefer point buy. They don't like random character generation. And this was, again, from what I understand, the first game to kind of do that in a role-playing game. But that is going to wrap up this particular installment in my history of tabletop role-playing games, and specifically looking at these two issues of Dragons, issues number 11 and 12. So I hope you enjoyed that. Please let me know in the comments which articles you like the best. If there's an article that you want me to dig more into, or just kind of in the future, I feel like these videos get kind of long. I already know if you're watching my channel at this point, I hope that you understand my videos are going to be long. And I think you're watching them because of that. But if there's something that you wish that I had spent more time on or less time on, anything like that, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I'm always trying to learn, like I said, learning about making videos just like I'm learning about being a better dungeon master. So I'm always helpful for constructive criticism as long as you're cool about it. And, if you didn't like it, that's fine too. I mean, it's fine to just move on and scroll to a video that you do like, I would say. That's also fine. I'll put it that way. So, but that's going to wrap up this video. And again, let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in the future, other kinds of content that you would like. And also while you're down below leaving a comment, make sure you check out the places where you can join me online on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, that kind of thing. You'll find a link to my blog where I share content, mostly for old school type role-playing games, old editions of Dungeons and Dragons. But, there's other things on there as well, reviews and whatnot. And that's going to be it for this video. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this particular video. So I actually recorded this video on Monday the 16th. And I made my notes earlier in the afternoon. I'm recording kind of in the later afternoon now. It's a little after 5. And so I didn't drink this while I was making my notes necessarily, but I'm drinking it now as I'm going through and starting to edit. But today is the start of Negroni Week 2024. So this is a thing that's been going on for a few years now. I think I first heard of it maybe 2019 is when I first heard of it. But again, it's a yearly event. And so it's produced or kind of created by Campari, which is one of the 3 essential ingredients of a Negroni. So that's the red, bitter Italian liqueur, aperitif liqueur. And then also Imbibe Magazine, which is one of my favorite magazines. It's one of the last ones that I still get in print. It shows up, I don't know, it's every other month or something like that. And it's Imbibe is all things beverages. So coffee and even like sometimes water. They'll do sparkling water. And then, they wine, beer, and spirits. So, and every year there's a charity that's associated with Negroni Week. This year it's for Slow Food. I think it was also them last year, but it's a group that works on sustainable food efforts across the world. And so when you go to a participating bar during Negroni Week, you can look it up on the website. There's, a portion of that is supposed to go to the charity. And then you can buy official Negroni merchandise, Negroni Week merchandise at the shop. I'm actually wearing a Negroni Week shirt right now, which you can kind of almost see in the reflection of my record down here. This is a design from a previous year, but I'm going to try to wear a different Negroni shirt every day this week. So anyway, this is a Negroni, which is equal parts gin, Campari, and sweet vermouth, Italian sweet vermouth. So I used Carpano Antica for my sweet vermouth. I, of course, used the Campari, and then I actually like to do higher portion of gin. So I do closer to between 1 1/4 ounce to 1 1/2 ounces of gin. And then I'll do a scant ounce of Campari and sweet vermouth, because I find that if you do equal parts, it's a little too sweet. I want to taste the gin. I want that herbalness, and I want that herbalness to cut through the sweetness of both the Campari, which Campari is bitter, but it's like bittersweet. And then sweet vermouth is also, it's not just sweet, it also has bitter components as well. And then traditionally would have an orange garnish. Now, as I was making this, I looked at my orange and it was just not in good shape. I've mentioned that a couple times. We've just not had good luck with our citrus lately. So, what I did was use my little atomizer here. So a few weeks ago, I cut some, I zested an orange. I zested an orange, and then I took the orange zest and I soaked it in high grain or neutral grain alcohol. So I used like 100 proof vodka, and then I steeped it and did a few other things, but essentially made like an orange oil. I'm almost out. You can see I have a little bit here, but I use this in place of not having a fresh orange. So this is a trick I learned at a bar here that, and sadly no longer exists. I don't want to spray it over my record, but there was a bar here that was located in the train station at Union Station in Los Angeles, and it was called The Number. It was like called 524 or something like that. Whatever it was named after when the old train used to come through, and it was this like little hidden kind of speakeasy bar that didn't open until like 5:24 p.m. or 4:44, whatever time it was, and they specialized in batch cocktails. So the idea was that you could go in and order like a batch martini or a batch Negroni, a batch Manhattan, and it was pre-made in a bottle, chilled. Their glasses were all in the freezer, and you walked in and they just poured it for you and gave it to you. And it was like $8 for like a high quality drink. It was just, it's batch made, but there's nothing wrong with batch making something as long as it's usually you'd want it to be all spirits, no like fruit juice or sugar or anything like that. It's going to separate. And they would spray their glasses with the little atomizer of either they had orange oil and lemon oil. And so I asked them once how they made it. And I came home and made some. And so I do it quite often just so I have something on hand. It's pretty shelf stable. I keep it in the fridge usually. But anyway, cheers to Negroni Week. This is like probably this or a martini would be my favorite like pre-dinner cocktails, just kind of depending on my mood. Just, a word of warning again, if you've never had Campari, it can be a little aggressive out the gate if it's something that you're just not used to, because again, it does have that kind of bitterness to it, but it works really well with this. It's really blended. Okay. As far as records, pick this up at Record Store Day in April of 2024. This is Nat King Cole live at the Blue Note, Chicago. And I think I'm going to say that this is probably my favorite live recording by Nat King Cole, and it's all, new, meaning it hasn't really been out there before, but it's a 2-disc set, 2 LP set of just all these great songs that of if you know Nat King Cole at all, you are going to recognize almost all of these songs, but hearing them play live with this, combo he's got here, guitar, bass, and drums backing him up. And it's just, he's so dynamic. He's so charismatic. And I just love it. I could listen to this over and over again. It's got all these great little additions in here. Comfortably air conditioned. I love that, the bottom right hand side there. But again, we talked about the songs, but then it's got all this additional material. All these great liner notes. I mean, there he is with Jackie Robinson. What a great photo that is. It says there's something miraculous on virtually every track here. I really dig this. And then there's another whole booklet in here, if I can get it out of the sleeve. I'm trying to be careful with my sleeve here, but all these old reprinted things from back in the day to kind of provide context for what was going on, some old ads and stuff. So it's a great set.
I actually don't know. I should have looked this up. If they did, I'll put a link. I don't know if it's something that you can still buy or if it was a Record Store Day exclusive. But you know what? You can go on Discogs and I'm sure find someone selling it. They also did a CD. I remember that very specifically because the rep for this came in. My friend owns a record shop. I've mentioned that before. I was working behind the register on Record Store Day to help out because it's just so busy. And the rep came through and was like, "Hey, I was just wondering, like, how did the albums go?" I was like, "They're gone." It was like they were gone. I don't know. We got maybe, not too many because it's a 2 LP and it was kind of expensive. We got maybe 10 and they were all gone within like the first couple of hours. And so the rep showed up and he just opened this duffel bag and gave us some CDs to give out to people. We could have sold them, but we hadn't logged them in. So we just ended up giving them to people who wanted to get this and couldn't. So anyway, definitely check this out. I love it. Again, it's such a performance from such a classic performer. He's really the epitome of like an entertainer, just like say like a Louis Armstrong. So that's going to be all for this bonus content. I hope you dug it. I hope you stuck around and you like this kind of stuff. Let me know if you like Nat King Cole, or even if you don't, I guess let me know that too. And cheers to Negroni Week. And if you haven't had Negroni, maybe visit your local watering hole this week and order one and see what you like. Make sure that they have the ingredients. So the one ingredient, well, you're going to have trouble if you go to a dive bar because they're probably not going to have either Campari or sweet vermouth. So you're going to need to go to like it doesn't need to be a high-end bar, but just, look at the shelf and see what kind of stuff they have. And then if you don't see it, ask them if they can make it for you. They should know how. And it is very easy. Like I said, traditionally 3 equal parts. So cheers. Thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.